everybody, welcome to the Wednesday episode of the Dog and Bandits. I'm Oren Phillips, and we are back with another true legend. Roy Thomas is back on the show. I didn't get to speak to him last time he was on. I got a chance to talk to him now. An absolute pleasure, an absolute pleasure. Mr. Thomas talks about his writing process, some of the projects he's been on, how he feels about editing, a lot of wonderful things. This was an absolute honor to speak to him. I think you guys are really going to enjoy it. So without further ado, Mr. Roy Thomas, the great Roy Thomas, joining us today. Sir, thank you so much for taking the time.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm just sorry it's taken a while, but just can't record at my place and been on the road a lot. So, this is the first chance we've had, but I'm glad to be able to do this. I know that John Morrow kept saying, you should do this thing with Dollar Bit. I said, we will as soon as we can,
Well, here we are. I want to jump around to a few different things, but I've been just waiting to talk to you about a project you did that for me as a reader, I felt you really had a good time doing, and that's the Crimson Avenger miniseries. It felt like to me that's a series you could have taken to 10 or 12 books with all the excitement you had, at least as a reader writing it. Could you talk a little bit how that project came together?
Well, it partly grew out of course, the Secret Origins. Was it number 5 or 6? One of the early issues of Secret Origins I had done back in the 80s, in which since Crimson Avenger was one of the earliest DC adventure characters, he just became one of the early issues of Secret Origins and so forth. And I had got Gene Colan to draw it, and my wife Dan and I wrote it together, and that was a lot of fun. And I think it was really more that DC suggested it. I don't know if it was my idea or DC's, but I wouldn't be surprised if DC didn't suggest it. I don't remember. I'd have to ask my wife. That was very much a joint project. In fact, she did. I sort of had her kind of think what she wanted to do, because she had done a lot of the research on the thing. So we worked together on it, but it was really very much a joint project. The main problem we had with it was that halfway through, the penciler killed his girlfriend, and that sort of derailed us, and we had to have an artist obviously replaced because the other one went to jail. I never met him. I guess he's out now. I guess it was, but that's the main thing I remember about it is that it's obviously a behind the scenes kind of thing. The story was a lot of fun. I think it dealt with, was it the West Coast World Fairs and things like that? Wasn't that part of it?
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember much about it, as a matter of fact, probably because whenever Dan and I worked on something and she kind of took the lead in it, it kind of has a tendency to kind of flow out of my mind. I sort of leave my mind there for the things I have to remember. And if she's remembering something, then I sort of feel I don't have to. And then, so therefore, I remember certain things from it, but I don't remember the details of the story the same way that I would maybe if something I did more on my own.
Gotcha. Well, that leads me to this, because
it was a fun series to do, though. I do agree we could have done a lot more. Crimson Avenger was obviously a sort of a copy of the Green Hornet. It's what the Shadow to some extent, probably Green Hornet as much as anything. Although Green Hornet, I suppose, was imitative of the Shadow too. And but it could have gone on. I would have loved to have done still more of them. I like the idea of doing that kind of character. Yeah.
What is it about the pulps? Because I've read that you're a big fan of the original, pulp stories that keeps these books alive through the years. I mean, there's still books coming out about the Shadow and a lot of those characters. What is it about us as an audience that draws us to these type of stories?
Yeah. I don't know. The funny thing is, I'm not really a fan of the pulps in the fact that I do collect a lot of reprints of them, and I have a few old ones here and there, not very many, but I'm really more a fan of the idea of the pulps than I am a reader of the stories. When I get them, I find I start reading them, and it's just not my kind of thing to read. I don't even read that much fiction anymore for years, and I end up wanting to read history and biography more than I would this. But that's not because even if it's good, with the exception of a few things, I can always dip into a Robert E. Howard or one of the better Burroughs things and find myself interested. And there are other things like that. But what I think it is that the pulps, just worked hard at creating this world, full of shadows and adventures and action, fast action and so forth. And some of these writers got really good at it, and they created really good characters, and they could put them into new situations month after month after month, and make the public like them for year after year. And that, of course, was one of the two big feeds into comic books. The two big feeders were the comic strips, obviously, but to an almost similar extent, the pulps. And the funny thing is, all that happened was that when it ended up coming out, the comic books basically almost drove the pulps out of business, because they attracted a lot of the same audience. But if anything, if they were the same price, they were a faster read. They had pictures with them and so forth, and they really hurt pulp sales. When comics got more popular, pulps got less popular. That's kind of a shame. And you'd think there would have been a big enough audience for both, but there didn't seem to have been.
Right. You mentioned a few moments ago that you enjoy reading about history, and that's something that has played into your writing, through the years. How do you pick historical moments to focus on, to include into the stories that you're doing?
I don't know. You can just about as easily say they picked B. I mean, I know that's kind of a cliche people use, but it's true. I don't usually go looking for something to include, but something just suddenly occurs to me. For example, back in the late 80s, early 90s, somewhere in there, when TSR became a comic book publisher for a while, and they had that one comic that was sort of based on their games. They wanted me to put something together. It was a time travel story and so forth. And they said, well, where would you want to put it? It didn't take a second to think that one fertile place was the area around Troy, because because you had, in ancient times, you had the Trojan War, and probably almost totally fictitious. Whatever happened wasn't very close to the Iliad or anything, but still, it's right there, not too many miles away, but about a couple of thousand, 1,000 or 2 years away. You have the fall of you had Constantinople, so you had the fall of Constantinople, 1453. And then in World War I knew you had the Battle of Gallipoli, which was a major turning point battle against the British and Winston Churchill's career and everything. So, and then so it just fell into place. And of course, you get that by reading a lot of history. Not that I'm an expert on it by any shape or means, but you just store these things in your head, and when the time comes about, it'll rise to the top simply because it's there. We all use our brains for stories. We just store different things in them. I have history. You probably have something else. I have other things, but history is a major part of it.
What really amazes me, and I'll gush here and fanboy a bit, is the time you were writing so many different books. How, as a writer, did you kind of put blinders on and focus in on, okay, today I'm going to do this, and not all of a sudden be like, oh, you know what, this might be a good idea for this book as well? How do you sort of focus on one book at a time when you had so many to work on?
Well, two things. The one is, when you're going to work on something, you kind of have to focus on it. It's just a bit of training, self-training. And, if you're going to write, you have to concentrate. So you shut out things. At the same time, I will say that you're right, that other things come creeping in. Either something that you're writing in the story suddenly makes you think of something else, or it just comes in unbidden simply because you're who you are. And there'd be times when I'd be writing a story, and all of a sudden I'd think of something else, and I'd stop writing that story for a little bit just to jot down a note or something. I was not the most disciplined writer. Okay. I got things done, but I wasn't as disciplined probably as Stan. I'd go home. For example, when we both worked home on Tuesdays and Thursdays after I was there a year or two. He had me start doing the same thing. And I was okay because it was like a raise. I got the same salary, but I only had to come into the office 3 days a week, and everything I wrote at home, I could vouch it for freelance. So it was like a considerable raise and everything, without actually giving me any more money, just not having me come in. It was the idea of working for home. I'd never thought of working for home as a writer, when you're working for a company at the same time, but it worked out. But but I would go all day unable. I'd get up. I'm ready to write by early afternoon, but I'm a night person. I'm just naturally a night person. And so I would all of a sudden. That's about the same time HBO started on TV, and all of a sudden, all these movies that I didn't care to bother to go see, all of a sudden it became imperative that I see them when they're on HBO. Or I remember, for example, that that I had gone to see Chinatown when it was first out,
Mhm.
and I liked it, but I don't know. There were a couple of things in the ending I wasn't wild about, and I didn't think that much more about it. And then what happened is on HBO it started coming on a lot, So I watched it two or three, four more times over. Every time Chinatown come on, there I am. You can't tape it like you could today,
Mhm.
or anything, tape it or record it in any way, stream it, anything like that. But at least you could watch it if you're there at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And so I would do that. And then, of course, come 10, 11 o'clock at night, it suddenly become time to annoy my wife by saying I have to stay up over here in the corner of the bedroom typing away while she's trying to sleep. Probably why I'm on my second wife now, but at least but I don't work at night anymore. I decided I gave up working at night totally. I knock
Mhm.
off work whatever I'm doing it by 6 o'clock in the afternoon, and that's it. I mean, it almost doesn't matter what the writing is I have to do. I say, nope, tomorrow. But it is hard to discipline yourself as a writer, and I wasn't the best at it. I guess at the same time I wasn't the worst. When I see what messes some other people made of their lives, like my good friend Gary Friedrich, who kind of drank himself out of the job there because he
Mhm.
decided he couldn't work unless he drank. Of course, that becomes a vicious. I mean, he was already drinking before, so I don't blame comics for that. But
Mhm.
it just made his bad habits come to the fore, and eventually he got an AA and straightened himself out and everything. But in the meantime, there are a lot of traps for a writer. Distractions, drink, drugs. You're on your own. You can do whatever you want to do. Nobody's watching you, and all you have to do is figure out some story to tell the boss tomorrow about why you didn't get the job done. You couldn't do that too well with Stan. He wasn't too agreeable about coming in and saying you couldn't get something done because nothing stopped him. So he wasn't. He didn't want people working for him that anything was going to stop from getting the writing done.
When you're working on a project, do you have a beginning and an end point in mind, or do you have a beginning and then you want to see where things are going to go to get to that conclusion?
Both. It depends on the story. Sometimes I just have a beginning.
Mhm.
Sometimes I know where I'm going in the ending. Sometimes I'm not sure, or I have two or three different ideas. It would all be, it just depends on the story. Some people probably always work the same way. Either they always very carefully plot it out, or maybe they always just have the beginning, or maybe they always have the beginning and ending and then fill in the middle. But I was somebody that I didn't have enough of a whatever it is guiding uh, principle or something to work the same way all the time. It just one thing would happen, and one story another thing would happen.
What kind of relationship did you like having with the artist? Because we hear stories that sometimes, they'll pass notes back and forth and try to work together on the book. Other times, the writer will give the artist the script and then they'll just take it from there. What kind of relationship did you like to have with an artist?
I liked whatever worked. Generally speaking, I prefer to just write out a story outline. I would write a two, three, four-page story and
Mhm.
send it to an artist. Occasionally, once in a while, we had to. We do some of that by phone, but I usually wrote out plots and send them off. However, there were some artists that didn't like that as much, or they wanted to get involved. One of the first I guess I did that with, probably the first, well, was actually probably the very first was Dick Ayers, because when I was given Sergeant Fury, I was finishing off a story that had already been plotted. But then the next issue, I was all getting all ready to plot a particular. I don't remember what the story was, but it was a quite different story. And Dick Ayers, whom I he met once or twice before, comes in and he has this story kind of worked out in his head that he wanted to do, set in Italy.
Mhm.
And you know, I mean, I had to make it clear to him, look, I'm the writer, so I'm going to write the story. if you want to do the story, we can talk it over. You can do it, but I'm the writer. You're not going to get paid anything extra, so I don't want you to feel like you're doing extra work, for nothing. But I'm not going to pay. If we're using this story, you're only going to be paid for being the artist and only credited with being the artist. So but if that's what you want to do because you really want to do it, but don't feel obligated, because I'm perfectly happy to sit down and write you a story. But he really wanted to do it, so we did it. It was okay. But after that, I made sure I always gave him a written plot, because I didn't want to be accepting money for work he did, and I wasn't going to take a dime less. If my rate was rate $10 a page or whatever it was, I wanted to do all the work, but I wanted to get all that money, and I wasn't going to split it with him or anybody else. However, so I let it go, and then after that point, mostly I was just doing written synopses for Werner Roth and X-Men and Don Heck when we started Avengers and different people. Once in a while it would just be talking things over, but mostly I would write things off. I guess the first time I really had that relationship going with anybody, I think Neil came first, which would be on X-Men, I suppose. I'm trying to remember, because two things happened pretty close together. Neil on X-Men and Gil Kane on Captain Marvel. And I'm not 100% sure which came first, because they had no particular relationship to each other. I'd have to come take a look. And in both cases, well, in the case of Neil came in with just wanting to do some book, and a low-level book, and Stan, said he could do the X-Men with me, but I was the writer. But Neil liked the idea of just talking stories over instead of my giving him a plot, because I was used to giving a plot to Don Heck and Werner Roth before. And I let Neil go ahead and do do whatever. I mean, it's not that he was doing whatever he wanted. What I meant is we would go out and we would talk over the story over lunch, and then he would go draw, and he was adding some details. He might change stuff because he forgot. Same thing that Stan and Jack had happen. And then I would write it, and it was fine. I was still the writer. If Neil wanted to change anything, all he had to do was say, I don't want to work this one anymore. And the next day he'd had a 3 or 4 page plot in the mail. And the funny thing is, I don't think it made any difference. I just let Neil do it because he wanted to do it, and we got good stories. Would the stories have been better or worse if I had written a 3 or 4 page outline of a somewhat different story and Neil had drawn it? Would anybody out there know the difference? It would still have been a probably fairly good story. It would have had my dialogue. It would have had Neil's storytelling and virtues. And probably the chances are most people couldn't have told the difference, which one was the one that Neil had a hand in plotting, which one wasn't. But Neil was, a gifted plotter in some way, and accepting deadlines, a good collaborator. And the same thing was true with Gil. In Gil's case, the first thing we did together was one where I had already plotted the story. I'd written a several-page plot, and it had already, in fact, been sent to and received by Don Heck for Captain Marvel. And suddenly Gil Kane comes wandering into the office, and to Stan, I barely knew him. We'd only had a hello, goodbye relationship for 3 or 4 years in the office. And he says he'd like to do Captain Marvel. He'd been working for DC, and he was really getting tired of it again, So he said, I'd like to take some character you're not doing it, that's not going anywhere, like Captain Marvel, which definitely was not going anywhere. And Stan said, well, Roy Thomas just came into me the other day with a new direction for the thing. And, talk to him and see if he'd like to work with you. And I said, yeah, I'd rather work with, I like Don Heck's work, but I'd rather work with Gil Kane. So we gave Don something else so he wouldn't lose any work, because he didn't have any great relationship he hadn't been doing much of Captain Marvel anyway. And and then I started working with Gil. Well, once we did that one story, then Gil decided he wanted to co-plot 2. And I said, well, that's fine. I'm the writer, and I'll be credited and plot as a writer, but and if you don't want to do that, I'll just write you out a plot. But no, he says, no, I'd rather we just talk it over. Some of the stories were more my idea. That one story about the one with the Jewish guy, and he ends up, and so forth. It has kind of a Holocaust kind of theme. I think it was Captain Marvel 19. That was an idea that Gil wanted to do. I had relatively little to do with the exact plot. We talked it over, but it was what Gil wanted to do, and I just helped kind of guide it and craft it and then dialogued it. The others were joint synopses, or maybe which may have probably my idea, and then we just talked it over. But I was willing to work with anybody in any way, shape, or form. It didn't really make too much difference to me because I just wanted to write some comics. I wanted them to be good. If the artist is going to be happier because he's also having an input on the story, I didn't mind. But I felt like I'm the writer, so he has to understand. If he doesn't want to accept that, then we go back to working the other way, and I'm perfectly willing to do that. But I wasn't willing to share credit or money on it. But if I decide I want to do more on my side,
Mhm.
more work than I'm being paid for, that would be my choice. And if he wanted to do more work than he was being paid for, that's his choice. So, and that's what they sort of did, because, and they were very happy with it. Later on, Neil started, complaining about, not to me, but later on, saying it was all him and all that, and that's a lot of crap. But he did contribute a lot in terms of stories to the X-Men and the Avengers stuff, and I would never in my life deny that. It just wasn't as much as he said, because if he had done that, I might as well stayed home and slept the whole time, and I did not. But it was really a joy to work with. A lot of these guys like him and Barry Smith, they were great to work with. It was only later on that it became unpleasant. It's sort of like, it's like when everything else is over,
Right.
and the story's published, then all of a sudden all the unpleasantness comes out. When you're working together, it's just fine and everything's going dandy. Well, except with Neil, the deadlines.
Right. Jeez. Looking
It's a
back
crazy,
now,
crazy business,
yeah, I was to say, looking back now, are there certain projects or books that you were on that you see as sort of evolutionary points for you as a writer? Like, okay, I did this and I felt this really worked and I grew from there.
Well, I don't know if I thought of it in those terms. I think I was gradually evolving and
Mhm.
generally getting better. I mean, it fits and stops. Sometimes I do an issue was a little better, then the next one might be slipped down a little. But I didn't have much time to think about that or about growth. Obviously, the thing to me was when I really got a series I really liked doing. There were things that I liked doing. Uh, I really enjoyed the Submariner, but of course I enjoyed it the most when John Buscema was drawing it. I got a little as good as the other people, Marie Severin and others were when they drew it with me. I was happier, with John doing it. I enjoyed the Avengers from the start. Obviously, I enjoyed it even more when John Buscema. There's a certain pattern there. Anything I worked on with John Buscema, or Gil Kane, or Neil Adams, or Barry Smith, that automatically sort of rose too near the top and it drew me along. Sometimes I learned from it, sometimes I didn't. I don't know. Uh, Probably the biggest evolutionary thing or revolution or whatever it was probably was doing Conan, because that was a step. Before that, I'm basically doing Stanley comics. I mean, obviously I'm doing it my own way. I'm writing them a little different consciously from the way Stan was. And I'm sort of trying for some of the same things, but also trying to do a few different things here and there, and not trying to just ape him increasingly as time goes on. But uh, but once I started had to do Conan, it put me into a little different frame simply because I'm no longer working in the reference of uh, Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and those couple of Marvel artists, maybe Ditko and so forth, particularly Lee and Kirby. Suddenly, I also have it. I have that, but now I have the influence of the pulp magazines, the original stories of Robert E. Howard. Even if I'm not adapting those stories, I'm trying to get in that head frame. This is not Stan Lee. I'm trying to think in terms of combining that with the mind of Robert E. Howard, the guy who made up Conan. And of course, when other adaptations come along or other characters, be it Tarzan or whatever, you're sort of doing the same thing. So that was probably a major step. Otherwise, I don't know if I made that many advances. I just kept getting more practice, and practice makes, well, in my case, not perfect, but practice makes a little bit less imperfect, perhaps.
I'm curious, when was there a point that you said to yourself, I belong in this industry, like I can do this. I know I can do this. What that you had confidence that you're doing the right thing, you're in the right profession.
Yeah, somewhere fairly early, but it took a little while. I mean, it didn't take too long, but maybe by the time I had done a few issues in a row of Sergeant Fury, which was the first series I ever was on for more than say 2 issues, when I had done the two Doctor Stranges. Uh, it's not that I felt like I was up with Stan or anything, but I felt like, well, I was sort of in the ballpark, and maybe I could be like the second string writer of this and that. And I felt a little better as I got into X-Men, more so with Avengers. I think once I got Avengers, a couple of years in, I became a little more confident, because that was the first book that I got that I really wanted to do. I didn't care about X-Men that much. It was a very minor Marvel title. I bought it. Sergeant Fury, I didn't even buy every copy of, but I was a fan because I didn't like war comics, even if they were drawn by Jack Kirby and written by Stan Lee. And I didn't buy every one until later on. I picked them up. X-Men I did, but that had never been a top Marvel book in those days. And so it was really the Avengers. But the problem, of course, was Stan wouldn't let me use some of the major characters, so I was always fighting him on that. But at least I didn't really want to do the Avengers. And I don't know. I guess I gradually got, you don't think about it. It's the old story about the guy who's carrying the baby calf, and sooner or later he's carrying an enormous cow. Well, I don't know how that works out in real life. At what point you just break your back and collapse. But in my case, I just kept trudging along, and I'm not that analytical a thinker. I just kept working at it, but I never stopped. We didn't have a lot of philosophical discussions among me and other writers. There weren't that many other writers around that I saw at the time, and so forth. So, and we just didn't have a lot of discussions about the craft of writing, And the only ones I had were the ones with Stan, and they would be mostly about, superficial things, or he would be talking about how he was crazy because he spent a half an hour trying to decide between two words on a page, which he actually did once or twice. He would tell me about. And so, I mean, he probably thought about it more than I did. I was just trying to, keep employed.
When you're creating a character, how does the blueprint begin? Is it a look? Is it a name, an ability? Where did you start to build a character from?
It totally depends on the character. Sometimes the name comes first. Usually it's the concept with me rather than the name. So I've never had a lot of faith I haven't come up with a lot of names that I really like a lot for characters. I like them okay, but I mean, they're not up there with the best of Stan's and some other people's. But I would just come up with a concept, and then different ones would start from different things. Warlock started from the idea of Jesus Christ Superstar, and I wanted to make up a character like that. And somehow the name Warlock came into my mind because it hadn't been used. I had used that as a villain in an X-Men story for a name, but I thought that's too good. That's a good name. We should use this for this character. In the case of Wolverine, of course, what was first was Canada. I wanted to get some Canadian readers, and I started looking, and Wolverine came out of that. It really didn't make any difference in the long run. If it wasn't Wolverine, it would have been some other name, and probably a character. What might have been a different character would have been some Canadian superhero. Iron Fist was because I went to see a kung fu movie. I think it was the first kung fu movie I went to. I can't remember the name of it, but it had a thing in it called the Ceremony of the Iron Fist. I just swiped that name Iron Fist. I was a little reluctant to, because we had Iron Man, and I didn't like the idea of repeating the iron. So why I didn't call it Steel Fist, say, I've always wondered about that. Why didn't I call him Steel Fist? Why Iron Fist? Why did I take the whole thing and so forth? And other characters, sometimes, or like in the case of Cage, Stan, as much as anybody, made up the character. He had more to do with making up that character than me or Archie Goodwin or anybody else. But I was the one who gave him the name Cage because he was looking for an offbeat kind of name that wasn't a superhero name. And I suggested, the name Cage. Archie added the Luke later as a sort of the first name. But, so it just really depends on the character. And you have to remember, I wasn't trying to make up many Marvel characters anyway, because I knew I wouldn't own them. So I was very happy to just recycle things. That's why there's another Black Knight. That's why there's another Vision when Stan told me to bring in an android. It's why, any number of characters, or some of the others. The Yellow Jackets was an old name of a character in a 1940s comic.
Mhm.
Grim Reaper was a hero in an old comic book, and I made it into. It was nothing like the character that I made up, but it just gave me the inspiration. I could have taken it from the legends of Grim Reapers and so forth, but I took it from the comic book character. And so you just grab up things, anything that you hear that sounds good and looks like it would look good on paper, grab somebody's attention and give the right kind of thing. Grim Reaper, Yellow Jacket, and then you just build a character around it.
I think that's one of the things I really enjoyed about some of the stuff you've done in Secret Origins is that you took a lot of these characters that people hadn't heard from in a while and built them up a backstory. I mean, a lot of it's based on what happened before, but you were able to make it a little thicker, flesh it out more. And by doing that, I thought it sort of tied together, what was and what was now, and sort of solidified a universe. Was it fun to sort of take these older characters and put a new spin on them?
Yeah, it's partly because, of course, I grew up reading those older characters. I mean, I
Mhm.
started not reading right away, but getting comics, going through them, in the middle 40s when I was about, under 5 years old.
Mhm.
And so, I already knew a lot of these characters. I had that, plus I had a natural feeling for history, which always interested me. So so you combine those things together, and it was just very, and what you're going to get is stuff like the Invaders and All-Star Squadron and various other ideas. I could have gone on like that forever. I loved doing comics that were rooted in history. I would have loved to have done a World War One superhero comic. People have done it now, but nobody had done it before. And all I could do was kind of hint at it in the Invaders, but I would have liked to have done more with that. I wouldn't have minded doing something if somebody had said, set a superhero comic during the Trojan War, or or set it here or set it there. I would have found that a lot of fun. It would have been a real challenge, but there wasn't a lot of market for it, so I didn't really push it. It was only when I was looking for some kind of offbeat project to keep me out of the mainstream of continuity that I would make up things like the Invaders, so that I wouldn't have to check with somebody what's Spider-Man doing this month or what's Captain America doing this month. I could just make up stories because they were set in 1942, or What If, because again, there was no continuity. Every issue was a new adventure, and it didn't matter where Spider-Man was that month. And that's what I want to do after I left being editor in chief, so I could sort of get off the treadmill of Marvel continuity. I love Marvel continuity. Don't get me wrong. I think that one of the big mistakes of some years is that they start letting all the writers and artists, decide what continuity is and go pick and choosing and cherry picking whatever events they want to and ignore everything else. I think that's was a drastic mistake because it makes the comics less real. It makes it seem less likely that they ever happen if the reality seems to shift from month to month, and every few months you're being told by some new young genius, a self-styled young genius, everything you thought you knew about this character is wrong, and I know the truth. And when you have that kind of egotist invading the space, I think it's bad for the whole company, and too much of that went on in later years.
I, I was, on that point, do you think that's what makes it sort of difficult for people to maybe jump into comics now? Because the characters they knew and the backstories they knew has changed so dramatically now that to pick up a Superman or something like that, they might not recognize
Yeah.
what's going on anymore.
Well, the funny thing is, you'd think it would make it easier because there's no backstory for them to know. But on the other hand, I think what it really is there's nothing there to grab onto anyway.
Mhm.
Obviously, every issue is somebody's first issue, so you have to treat it as if somebody can enjoy a comic without having read the past 5 or 10 or 20 years of continuity, because otherwise, you're going to have nothing but a bunch of old guys reading the comics. They're slowly dying off. But on the other hand, if you have a rich backstory, I think I just think it's good for the character. It underpins the character, even if it's not referred to. It's there. I mean, Batman's whole history, Superman's history, Captain America's history. It's back there. Once you start ignoring it, or saying it doesn't matter, or this didn't happen and that didn't happen and so forth, um, I think what you're basically doing is you're just throwing away the baby with the bathwater there, and what you're ending up left with is just a guy in a costume, a Rorschach block that so many of the heroes now have become, Batman in particular, I think, had become Rorschach tests for whoever happens to be writing a comic book at a particular time. And, I don't want to have to pick up a book and suddenly be analyzing not the character, but the writer. Every time you pick up a book, you're having to figure out the mindset of the writer. What you want to do is immerse in the story, and you don't have to figure out the writer's predilections before you do that. I remember one guy, came up to me, and this was back in the like 70s or early 80s, something like that. And he was talking about how he felt like he was now the definitive Batman writer. And I was just thinking, my God, I like this guy, but I thought, wait, the definitive Batman writer, the Batman person, that was Bill Finger and Bob Kane back in, 1939 and the early 40s. And if you had to have somebody else, it was going to be somebody like Dick Sprang or somebody in the middle 40s. It was not going to be somebody in the 70s or 80s. Although you have to admit, once again, defying almost every rule you ever come up with, there's Neil Adams doing Batman. And if anybody ever redefined Batman, and to the point where you can say his influence is still strong, probably, if anybody's is, even the people who almost never heard of it would be Neil. But, there are phenomena like Jack Kirby and Neil Adams. You can't think of too many others. They rise above whatever kind of generalities you're going to make about things. I always said about Neil, the instant Neil drew almost anything, not quite everything, but almost anything, he almost immediately became one of the best artists who ever did it. It almost became not definitive exactly, but it became about as good as the character ever looked, and everything. And Jack wasn't like that, but he had his own other strengths, and so forth. And, but you don't find many people that are like that have that kind of strong stamp of personality. Steve Ditko was a wonderful artist. His Spider-Man and Doctor Strange are great, but what else did he ever do that made any real impact on popular culture? His Mr. A is interesting to a certain number of people, and, but even Jack Kirby, you got at least he went through, he had Captain America in the early 40s, and then he's doing romance comics with Simon, and starts that field. Then he's in there with Stan, and then he at least does the Fourth World, which I don't think as highly as some do, but it was still an accomplishment of its own kind. But not many people are capable of doing that. Guys like he and Neil are. There are one or two others maybe if I thought long enough, but there aren't many of them.
I was about to ask, if you've worked with so many people, who are some folks that you think don't get the credit they deserve? Folks that you've worked with who really did some amazing stuff that may not be as popular as some of the bigger names that are out there.
Well, some of the people that I liked and felt undervalued, one of them that I know all of us, Jerry Conway, Len Weed, Marv Wolfman, and I, when we were sort of some of the main writers for Marvel and in comics, agreed was Ross Andru, who became one of the early Spider-Man writers. I could see why some people didn't like. He was a little stiff in a certain ways and so forth, but he was such a good storyteller. We all loved working with him. He was an undervalued artist, I always felt. Sal Buscema probably was, because he was in the shadow of his brother, and after a couple of years he kind of lost that original or the John Buscema influenced style, and he became more of a generic Marvel style, but he did it really well. Another guy who was good in his own way was Frank Robbins, who did Invaders with me and had done Batman at least. But he was so stylized, I can understand why he might have become too much of an acquired taste. His figures were a little rubbery and so forth. But I love. See, the reason I might like working with someone would be quite different maybe from the reason a reader might like reading him. I would like him because he tells a good story, which is a little more subtle thing for a reader to recognize. If as a writer I can overcome storytelling faults from an artist, then they won't notice so much, so they won't notice that. But people like myself and other writers, we appreciate, especially if we work the old Marvel style, we appreciated the guys who were really good storytellers. And, Jack was as good as they got, but others, guys like John Romita and, John Romita's, I guess, valued enough, but he was, about as good as they ever got, really, in certain ways. You don't get much better than that as a guy who can just really draw and make everything beautiful. But I'm trying to think if there was anybody else that other people that were. I loved working with Jerry Ordway at DC. He was, he wasn't an action artist in the same sense that the artists at Marvel were. It was the story. His figures weren't stiff; they were just a little more realistic and relaxed. And they wouldn't have been the kind of thing that Stan would have liked. But when we were working together on books like Infinity and All Star Squadron, I mean, there was nobody I would rather have been working with than him on that material. It just looked so beautiful to me. You know, other artists were just the same artists everybody, liked. I mean, Rich Buckler, he imitated, but he was really good.
Right.
And I feel very, lucky to have been able to work with so many good people. Mike Plug, I only worked with a couple of times, but I enjoyed that very much. He had such a wonderful style. It looked like it was influenced by Eisner, but I guess he drew like that before he ever met Eisner or knew anything about it. It turned out, and the nice thing was, being in the position I was at Marvel, I was able to get to work with the people I wanted to work with in that first time around, especially through about 1980 or so. After that, when I came back in the latter 80s, it wasn't as much fun because I didn't have my pick of the artists. I sort of had to take the artists they gave me, and I got to work with some very good people that way. Jackson Guice and a number of other really good people, and all the rest of them were trying their darndest. But it wasn't quite the same as when you're able to pick and get, Buscema and Barry, an upcoming Barry Smith, and people, and Neil comes walking in, and here's Gil Kane. That's that was the golden decade, for me.
Most definitely.
Maybe not for them, but for me.
I want to jump to your days as an editor. With an editor, you want to get the best.
How do you spell that?
What'd you say?
Z or D-A-Z-E? It's a little bit of both.
Because you want to get the best out of the people you're working with. And sometimes, that means, encouraging them have the best they can do. Sometimes that means having to have some tough conversations. And that might include some veterans, some people who've been in the industry for a while. Yeah. What was your approach as an editor, working with people?
Well, I was pretty chicken about it. I wasn't. Stan could just, take any artist, Jack, John Buscema, any of them, take them in there and, talk about how much he admired, and he did. But at the same time, then really rake them over the coals for something they did. I don't think it always worked. I mean, John Buscema really disliked Stan for the rest of his life. I never heard him say practically another good word, unless it was in public, about Stan after the showdown they had over Silver Surfer #4, which you probably heard about, where this beautiful job, and Stan just treated it like everything was wrong about it. The first thing he did when John told me that night, or first night or two, he closed the door. We had all seen it outside, this beautiful job with Silver Surfer in Asgard and so forth, this kind of Arthurian version of Asgard. Just knocked us out. Me, Marie Severin, 2 or 3 of us around there. And I had some experience this time. I'd been in the field 4 or 5 years by then. And Stan takes a look at it, calls John in, and John says, the first thing he says when he closed the door is, forget what those guys outside told you. It's all wrong, and I'll tell you why. And he proceeded, as John said, he felt to demolish his work for the next half hour or so. And John came out shaken and angry. I saw him a night or two later at another function, and I never heard him say another kind word about Stan and everything. And the funny thing is, I don't know why. I could only see 1 or 2 tiny points of what Stan said. I think he was almost dead wrong, and as dead wrong as I ever saw him be. But maybe there was a point here and there. But the funny thing, of course, which you may have read, is that a decade or 2 later, when they reprinted it somewhere, it came to Stan's attention, Stan called John up and said, I was just looking at that Silver Surfer #4. It says, that's the best thing. Look at that. Because he didn't, even though he said it was all wrong, he didn't change much of anything on it in that time. And otherwise he probably would have. And he said, that's the best looking thing you ever did. And John reminded him of what he had told him about it, probably in as friendly a way as he could manage, without getting angry. And Stan was just incredulous. He couldn't believe it, So John said, well, maybe he had a fight with his wife that day, or he was just feeling bad, or something struck him wrong. Could be, or maybe he was just saw something different. I don't know exactly. I never could figure that out because I felt it was one of the most disastrous things Stan ever did. It led John to decide he was going to become a Jack Kirby clone because he felt that's what Stan wanted, and he never totally did. But his style got less individualistic after that, and I think it was. I think that that's Stan's fault. But nobody's perfect. Stan was one of the best editors in the field, but you can't be right all the time. And that was one time he was disastrously wrong. Luckily, John didn't either quit or kill him, And myself, I couldn't quite do that unless I was, practically ready to fire somebody or I really disliked them or something, and I never had that thing. But the one thing, Stan was much more willing to risk. Or maybe he didn't even notice he was doing it. By that time, he'd been in a position of power for so long. See, the thing I always felt about Stan is, much as I admired the guy, he had been in a situation since he was 18 or 19 years old of having no equals. He had Martin Goodman above him, and he had a whole mess of people below him at various times, but he didn't have any equals. He had, not like at DC, he had their editors to be rubbing shoulders and elbows with. It was just Stan. Everybody either kowtowed to him or was dumping on him like Goodman. Right? So as a result, Stan, was quite willing to make any kind of imperious statement he want and have somebody change stuff and just figure, well, it's a business. They shouldn't care. They're paid to draw. If I have them redraw something, even though, of course, he wasn't, in many cases, paying them again. So therefore, they're going to resent the fact that they have to do something twice if they don't agree that it was wrong. And, what artist agrees that something was wrong just because the editor says he thinks it was? Sometimes they might, but most of the time they're not going to. My own tendency, and seeing how Stan worked out, reinforced this in my mind, was I was much more willing to go along with what an artist wanted if I felt he was in the right general direction. And in my case, it was a little easier because by the time I was rising in, authority and arrogance and everything else, Stan and Jack had already established so much the pattern of what Marvel was like that an artist comes into the field, he sort of knows what he's supposed to do. I mean, he's going to do his own version of it. But if he doesn't know what a Marvel comic is, then he needs to get some Kirby-esque action, not make it look like Kirby necessarily, but get action in it, and this and that, and liveliness, then he doesn't belong there anyway. So most of the artists you work with already knew a fair amount about what was expected with them. So I felt I had relatively minor fine-tuning. Stan was willing to come in there and still devastate somebody to get them to change a panel or two and make them feel bad about it. I sometimes get a panel or two redrawn or something like this. But, my feeling usually was that 9 times out of 10, I could work with what they did, or maybe I could get an inker or somebody to change a panel or so, and Stan would take some of Jack's stories. He'd like toss out whole pages and, things like this. And I guess there was that Galactus origin story that Jack drew one version of and Stan, threw away part of it, rewrote it all and so forth. And it's strange because Stan was so good, and yet he somehow managed to make enemies out of some of his best, his best writers, guys like Buscema and Kirby and so forth, would have real grudges against him. And part of that was because sometimes, Stan thought he was making a case and getting them to agree. What he was actually doing was he was being the boss, so they had to go along with it. But that's not mean that they're not going to resent it. Jack had years of resentment before he left. Some of it may be overblown, but probably some of it deserved. None of us is perfect. I've made people angry when I make some comment, whether I tried to or not, and you can't help that. Sometimes, you just have to tell people it's got to be this way. And if they don't agree with you, they're going to nurse a grudge. You're going to forget about it. And 20 years later, they're going to be talking to the fan press, about this thing you did to them, I've got one artist that I gave his first regular assignment to. And then I quit being editor-in-chief, so I didn't have many assignments to give anymore. And later, 20, 30 years later, I had a pretty good relationship with this thing. And then suddenly 20, 30 years later, he's talking about how I wouldn't give him enough assignments. I gave him his first assignment, a regular ongoing book, every issue of it. And he thought how I hadn't done enough for him. So, and harbored this grudge and has come out against me in 10 different ways ever since. And makes no sense to me. I never thought enough about him to consider him an enemy. He didn't matter enough to me. but I had done him a favor, if anything. It wasn't a professional. I mean, it was a professional thing, not a personal favor. But I was thinking, if anything, he ought to be grateful I gave him this assignment. And, I never, and unless he can point to something I really did against him, he ought to shut up. But he doesn't. That's just something you have to live with, and unless he and I ever discuss it in person, face to face, in some way or other, either on a podcast or just in person, it's just never going to be settled. I just have to live with the fact that, he and I are going to disagree about this for the rest of our lives,
On that point, a little bit before, when you're putting teams together on a book, what were you looking for specifically between an artist and a writer to think that that's going to work well to get these stories out?
I didn't really look for our teams.
Okay.
I mean, usually I looked for a good writer, and I figured any of our good writers, any of our good artists can work together and do a good job. And that was my main thing. However, I think more than Stan, I was open to the idea of teams because I was sort of a member of a team with various people at one time or the other. They might not have thought of it that way because I was sort of also part of management. But I thought of myself as sort of being part of a team with Barry Smith, on Conan, or with John Buscema on some stuff. And, even if it was it's an unequal team when one side is also, an editor. But I was much open to the idea of people coming if they wanted to work together. I saw, if anything, it seems to me there's a good chance you'll get a better product that way. If the two people are good, and if you like their ideas, maybe what they do together, if it doesn't work out, you can always change it. So when Steve Englehart and Jim Starlin came to me with the idea of Shang-Chi that they wanted to do, I mean, I made a couple little tiny minor, changes to it, but I thought it was great. I didn't try to figure out, would somebody else be a better artist or a better writer? I said, these guys came with it, let's run with it. So I went in, Stan said, okay. So next thing you know, they're off doing it. And that happened, with, I think Buckler was doing Deathlock, but he wanted a writer. So we lined up a writer with him, with Doug Munch, and they became kind of a team on that book. Mm-hmm. If you could put two people together who are a team, and they work together, then so much the better. But I didn't look for a team. I figure they're all teams. They're all professional writers who can write, and the artist is going to draw, and that'll be fine. If it doesn't work out, we'll find out in a few pages, and we'll change it.
You get to Marvel, and very quickly, there's a lot of pressure being put on you. There's a lot of work being given to you, a lot of assignments. As a young person, how are you dealing with having to carry all this stuff that's going on at the company?
I reveled it. I was 24 years old. I'd hated high school teaching. Suddenly I get a chance to do a job I wanted. I was willing to take and do whatever Stan, wanted me to do, short of assassinating somebody. Whatever he needed me to. I mean, he never asked me, to do until maybe the 70s. One or two things that I just refused to do, but generally speaking, I was just there to do whatever he needed me to do. Mm-hmm. And Stan wasn't an unreasonable person. He didn't expect you to be superhuman to be able to do everything. He understood when something was, getting to be too much, or if it was too much. And I don't think he ever overloaded me. He gave me a fair amount of maximum, but if it turned out looked like I was a little too busy or had too much, then we just discussed getting rid of one assignment so I could do it, so I could do something else. It was a very reasonable thing, and I was eager to do whatever I could. A lot of it involved, more freelance money, but even if it didn't add up to any money, I was happy to do it. I just loved being in comics. I had loved comics ever since I was 4 or 5 years old. Here I was working in the field. Working for the guy I considered the best writer and editor in the field at the time, working with certainly people who were as good as any artist in the field. I mean, when I came there, you had, within that short time, you had, Ditko was just about to get out, but he had been doing, Romita comes in. You had Kirby, John Buscema, John Romita, Gene Colan. I mean, my God, and then other people coming in slowly. And even the people you weren't working with, because they were off on their own, like a Storenko, you're surrounded by so many good people that you're just, I was just happy to be there, and whatever Stan needed done, I was willing to do. I had no ever feeling at that time, oh, someday I'm going to be the editor of Marvel Comics. You know, because first of all, Stan, when I went to work there, what was he, 42, something like that? I mean, he obviously had a long way to go. He was about 18 years older than me,
Mhm.
you know, and you know, and he once looked over at me, remember, sometime in that first year, says, I could have been your father, I said, well, I said, Stan, in some ways you practically are. But I just thought I hadn't put that line in my autobiography. I should go back and add that. Anyway, maybe it happens in volume 2. I don't know. Anyway, but uh, I was just happy to be Stan's number 2. His second manana. As I
Right.
put it in a podcast recently with Alex Brand. I had no higher ambition. To be the number 2 guy at Marvel was as high as I was likely to be thinking at that stage. I had no grand ambition that I wanted to. I wasn't like Stan had been in the early days. Someday I want to write the great American novel. I feel 5 billion people trying to write the great American novel. I'd like to write the great American comic book, but I didn't have any. I I was kind of intimidated by the novel writing. And at the same time, I didn't feel like needed to add one more mediocre novel to the stack of billions and billions of mediocre novels written out there. I just assumed, be a good comic writer. So I never did get around to writing a novel. I did about everything else, but not quite that.
I want to be mindful of your time, but I just want to one last question and it's pardon me if it's a bit of a doozy, but what is Roy Thomas at his best? If someone said, Mr. Thomas, what did you do for a living? If you were to pick something that you've done and say, like, this is what I've done, what would you think is you hitting all cylinders?
I don't know. I've never really, thought about it. I just think of myself as a guy who writes and sometimes in the past has edited comic books. And I wouldn't point to any one accomplishment. Obviously some things loom larger for other people,
Mm.
than they might for, some people would say, would think about the Avengers because of, various things with the Vision or the Kree Skrull War. Or some people would think of Conan because that was a comic I did so much. It was kind of different and offbeat. Somebody else, although you'd probably get stoned for doing it, would mention Wolverine because even if I didn't write the character, I made up the concept for one of the most popular Marvel characters not created by Stan Lee, co-created by Stan Lee. And so, but I don't really have any one particular thing. The thing I'm proudest of is just having been in the field, having had a good time doing it, and having left behind some stories that some of them are good, some of them aren't so good. But you take the best of them. You can make a reasonable sized collection of decent stories. I think they're not gonna make the Ghost of Will Eisner or Harvey Kurtzman or Stanley, Run for the Hills or anything like that. But I'm not really ashamed of the life that I live or of the work. And if anybody thought that I should be because I was a comic book writer. I mean, that was the older generation. That was Stan, and going around saying he was a magazine editor. And I understand why. We all do. Or Julie Schwartz, who would always have preferred to have been in science fiction, than in comic books. People like that. Mort Weisinger, who was, I think, a self-hater because he was making a lot of money out of comic books. Things like that. I was always happy. I was just lucky. I came along at a time when I could just be proud to be in comic books. And if I met people and they didn't understand that, they felt like this either was some stepping stone, temporary thing, or something that I either had to do, or why would I want to do that, so forth. I just, I explained myself briefly, and then I would just dismiss them because they weren't me, and what do I care what these people want? Let them go teach high school in Missouri. I was up for having a good time writing comic books and reporting to Stan Lee, and 9 times out of 10 that was a pleasant day's work.
And we are back. Yes, I'm so excited I got to speak to Mr. Thomas. So many books he's written. Just hearing his thoughts about what it takes to be a good editor. All the different stories he told about working at Marvel and DC, and that it's he has so many pieces of history that he has been a part of. because of his creativity, because of his writing, because of his editing. It's really so incredible. So, Mr. Thomas, thank you again for taking the time to speak with us. Guys, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.